Poles Apart by Jean Willis and Jarvis. As everyone knows, penguins are found at the South Pole and never at the North Pole. At least not until the day the Pilcher Browns got lost on the way to a picnic. Mr. Pilcher Brown was in charge of the map. He told everyone to turn right at the snowman, which was wrong. Now, here they all were on the other side of the world. Mr. and Mrs. Pilcher Brown, Peaky, Potts and Pog, drifting towards an enormous, furry, white something. Is it a lion? Is it a tiger? Asked Peaky and Potts. Is it a picnic blanket? Asked Pog. The enormous something looked them up and down. He had never seen anything like the Pilcher Browns before. I'm Mr. White, he said. I'm a polar bear. And you are? Parrots, said Peaky and Potts. Pork pies, said Pog. We're penguins, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. What are you doing here? Wondered Mr. White. This is where polar bears live, not penguins. We're going to a picnic at the South Pole, said Pog. This is the North Pole, my friends, said Mr. White. The South Pole is 12,430 miles that way. So I was a few miles out, shrugged Mr. Pilcher Brown. Anyone can make a mistake. Don't think of it as a mistake, said Mr. White. Think of it as a big adventure. I have often dreamt of being the first polar bear to reach the South Pole. Mummy says we should always follow our dreams, says Peaky. Daddy says we should follow him, says Potts. Lead the way, Mr. White, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. The penguins followed Mr. White over land and sea. Eek, said Peaky. Whoa, said Potts. Can we have our picnic now, said Pog. But it wasn't the best spot, so they followed Mr. White all the way to America. Howdy, said Mr. Pilcher Brown. Busy, said Peaky. Buzzing, said Potts. Can we have our picnic now, said Pog. Not now, dear, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. America was awesome, but it wasn't home. So they followed Mr. White all the way to England. How do you do, said Mr. Pilcher Brown. Grey, said Peaky. Grand, said Potts. Can we have our picnic now, said Pog. Not now, dear, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. England was charming, but it wasn't home. So they followed Mr. White all the way to Italy. Ciao, said Mr. Pilcher Brown. Wet, said Peaky. Wonderful, said Potts. I need a wee, said Pog. Not in there, dear, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. Italy was magnifico, but it wasn't home. So they followed Mr. White all the way to India. Namaste, said Mr. Pilcher Brown. Hot, said Peaky. Huge, said Potts. Put the python down, dear, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. India was dazzling, but it wasn't home. So they followed Mr. White all the way to Australia. Good day, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. Faster, said Peaky. Fun, said Potts. Can we have our picnic now, said Pog. Soon, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. Australia was bonza, but it still wasn't home. So they followed Mr. White over the land and over the sea. On and on they went. But Of all the wonderful places in the world, there was no place like home. Are we nearly there yet? Said Peaky, Pots and Pog. It's not far now, said Mr. White, and they followed him, left, right, all the way home. Please stay, Mr. White, said Peaky and Pots. You can share our picnic, said Pog. So Mr. White stayed, and for a while he was happy. But the South Pole wasn't his home. He was a polar bear, and polar bears don't live there. Which is why he said goodbye and walked 12,430 miles all the way back to the North Pole, where he belonged. He'd followed his wildest dreams, had the best adventure. Even so, he was sad to think that he would never see a penguin again. But to Mr. White's delight, he did. Hello, how did you get there? He said. Where is your family? Here we are, said Mr. Pilcher Brown. Someone put my egg in your hat, said Mrs. Pilcher Brown. Peaky Pots pointed at Pog. Can we have our picnic now? He said. And although the North Pole isn't home to penguins, Mr. White was always happy to see friends. Welcome back, he said.